The envelope was cream-colored, the kind of stationery that was supposed to convey professionalism and authority. It was taped to my front door with a strip of cheap masking tape, the adhesive already failing, the envelope flapping slightly in the afternoon breeze. I pulled it off and opened it, my fingers numb with a premonition I couldn't quite name. The letter inside was brief, formal, and devastating. It was a notice of eviction issued by the Homeowners Association Board, signed by Marcus Webb, the board president. The reason cited was a series of violations that I had never committed: unauthorized modifications, noise, complaints, failure to maintain my property. The accusations were vague, unsupported, and clearly fabricated. I read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing new layers of absurdity. The unauthorized modifications referred to a garden shed I had built 2 years earlier, a structure that had been approved by the board at the time. The noise complaints were from a party I had hosted 6 months ago, a quiet gathering that had ended by 10 in the evening. The failure to maintain was a reference to a patch of lawn that had been damaged by the community's landscaping crew, a problem I had reported multiple times. The letter was a work of fiction, a carefully constructed narrative designed to justify my removal. I had lived in this community for 12 years. I had paid my dues on time, attended every meeting, volunteered for every committee. I had been a model resident, a contributor to the community's success. But all of that had changed when Marcus Webb had been elected president. Marcus was a petty tyrant, a man who had turned the HOA into his personal fiefdom. He had a habit of targeting residents who refused to kowtow to his authority, who questioned his decisions, who dared to challenge his rule. I had been one of those residents, and now I was paying the price. The first sign of trouble had come 6 months earlier, when Marcus had proposed a new set of rules that would have given him even more power over the community. I had spoken against the proposal at the board meeting, had pointed out the flaws, had rallied other residents to oppose it. Marcus had been furious, his face red with a rage he could barely contain. He had warned me that there would be consequences, that I would regret challenging him. I had dismissed his threats as the bluster of a man who had grown too accustomed to getting his way. Now I understood. He had been planning this, biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. I called my neighbor, a woman named Sarah, who had been through a similar ordeal with Marcus. She had been targeted for eviction 2 years earlier, had fought the charges, had eventually won. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with concern. I explained what had happened, reading the letter aloud, my voice trembling with barely suppressed anger. She listened in silence, then let out a long, slow breath. "He's doing the same thing to you that he did to me," she said. "Fabricated violations, baseless accusations, a notice of eviction that's designed to intimidate you into compliance. Don't let him win. Fight him. Document everything." I took her advice to heart. I spent the next few days documenting everything: the original approval for the shed, the noise complaint that had been resolved, the damage to my lawn that had been caused by the landscaping crew. I reached out to other residents who had been targeted by Marcus, collecting their stories, compiling their evidence. The pattern was consistent, a series of abuses that had gone unchallenged for years. The first resident I contacted was a man named Thomas, a retired teacher who had lived in the community for over 2 decades. He had been targeted for eviction after refusing to support Marcus's re-election campaign. The charges were similar: unauthorized modifications, noise complaints, failure to maintain. Thomas had fought the charges, had won, but the process had cost him thousands of dollars in legal fees and years of stress. He was still bitter, still angry, and he was eager to help. The second resident I contacted was a woman named Elena, a single mother who had been driven out of the community by Marcus's harassment. Elena had been a model resident, a woman who had volunteered for every committee and attended every meeting. But Marcus had targeted her after she had questioned his handling of the community's finances. The harassment had been relentless: fines, warnings, threats. She was still angry, still hurt, and she was ready to tell her story. The third resident I contacted was a man named David, a former board member who had resigned in protest after witnessing Marcus's abuses. David had been a voice of reason on the board, a man who had tried to hold Marcus accountable. But Marcus had outmaneuvered him, had turned the other board members against him, had forced him out. David was still connected to the community, still aware of what was happening, and he was willing to share his insights. The pieces were falling into place exactly as I had planned. I was building a network of allies, a coalition of the betrayed and the disillusioned. Each of them had a story to tell, a piece of the puzzle that would eventually reveal the truth. I also began to examine Marcus's financial records. The HOA's finances were a matter of public record, accessible to any resident who knew where to look. I requested copies of the board's financial statements, the budget, the audit reports. The documents were revealing a pattern of mismanagement that would eventually become Marcus's undoing. The first discovery was a series of payments to a landscaping company that was owned by Marcus's brother-in-law. The payments were inflated, the services overpriced, the contracts poorly documented. It was a clear conflict of interest, a violation of the HOA's ethics policy. The second discovery was a series of unauthorized expenses, charges that had been approved by Marcus without board approval. The expenses were for personal items, meals, travel, entertainment. They were small amounts, individually insignificant, but they added up over time. The third discovery was the most damning. Marcus had been using the HOA's funds to pay for his own legal fees, expenses that had been incurred during the dispute with Thomas. The payments were unauthorized, undocumented, and clearly illegal. I documented everything, creating a comprehensive file that would be almost impossible to refute. The evidence was overwhelming, a clear pattern of financial misconduct that would destroy Marcus's credibility. I was building a case, a detailed record of his abuses that would eventually be presented to the community. I also began to plant seeds of doubt. I started having conversations with other residents, expressing my concerns in vague, general terms. I mentioned that I had heard rumors about Marcus's financial mismanagement, that I was worried about the community's future, that I thought something was wrong. The seeds were planted, and they began to grow. The chaos was beginning. I could see it in the eyes of the residents, the whispered conversations at community events, the tense atmosphere that had settled over the neighborhood. Marcus was losing control, his confidence shaken by the subtle attacks that I had orchestrated. He didn't know who was behind them, didn't know that the man he had tried to evict was the architect of his destruction. The satisfaction was building, a quiet anticipation that had become almost unbearable. I had been patient, had waited for the right moment, but the moment was approaching, and when it came, I would be ready. The investigation began in my home office, a room that had been transformed from a comfortable study into a war room. The walls were covered with documents, photographs, and a sprawling web of connections that traced Marcus's pattern of abuses. I had cleared the space of everything that reminded me of the community I had once loved, replacing sentiment with strategy, emotion with evidence. The desk was covered with files, each one meticulously organized, each one a piece of the puzzle that would eventually reveal the truth. I started with the HOA's governing documents, the bylaws, the covenants, the rules and regulations. All of them were available to any resident who requested them. I had requested copies months ago, long before the eviction notice had arrived, and had studied them carefully. The documents were detailed, comprehensive, and surprisingly clear. They outlined the board's authority, the procedures for enforcement, and the rights of residents. And they revealed a critical weakness. The board had failed to follow its own procedures. The first discovery was a violation of the notice requirement. The bylaws required that any enforcement action be preceded by a written warning, a notice of violation, and an opportunity to cure. It was a direct notice of eviction, bypassing the graduated enforcement process that was required by the governing documents. I filed a letter, a piece of evidence that would be impossible to refute. The second discovery was a violation of the hearing requirement. The bylaws required that any resident facing eviction be given the opportunity to appear before the board, to present evidence, to cross-examine witnesses. The notice I had received had offered no such opportunity. It was a unilateral action, a decision that had been made without due process. I filed the notice, a piece of evidence that would expose Marcus's disregard for the rules. The third discovery was the most damning. The eviction notice had been issued without board approval. I had reviewed the board's meeting minutes. The minutes showed no discussion of my case, no vote on my eviction, no authorization for the notice. Marcus had acted alone, a unilateral decision that was a clear violation of his authority. I filed the minutes, a piece of evidence that would expose his abuse of power. The fourth discovery was the pattern of abuses. I had collected the stories of other residents who had been targeted by Marcus, and the pattern was consistent. He had a habit of fabricating violations, of issuing baseless fines, of threatening eviction. The targets were always the same: residents who had questioned his authority, who had challenged his decisions, who had refused to comply with his demands. I started with Thomas, the retired teacher who had been targeted for eviction after refusing to support Marcus's re-election campaign. Thomas had provided me with copies of the fines, the warnings, the notices. The pattern was unmistakable. Marcus had escalated the enforcement actions, had fabricated violations, had threatened Thomas with eviction. Thomas had fought back, had won, but the process had cost him years of stress and thousands of dollars in legal fees. I continued with Elena, the single mother who had been driven out of the community by Marcus's harassment. Elena had provided me with emails, texts, and voicemails that documented the harassment. Marcus had been relentless, a constant stream of threats and accusations that had worn her down. She had eventually given up, selling her home at a loss and moving to a different community. Her story was a tragedy, a reminder of the human cost of Marcus's abuses. I moved on to David, the former board member who had resigned in protest after witnessing Marcus's abuses. He had been a voice of reason on the board, a man who had tried to hold Marcus accountable, but Marcus had outmaneuvered him, had turned the other board members against him, had forced him out. David's account was a devastating indictment of Marcus's leadership. The fifth discovery was Marcus's financial mismanagement. I had obtained copies of the HO's financial statements, the budget, the audit reports. The documents were revealing a pattern of irregularities that would eventually become Marcus's undoing. I started with the payments to the landscaping company owned by Marcus's brother-in-law. The payments were inflated, the services overpriced. I cross-referenced the payments with market rates, identifying the discrepancies, the overcharges, the pattern of self-dealing. I continued with the unauthorized expenses, the charges that had been approved by Marcus without board approval. The expenses were for personal items, meals, travel, entertainment. I documented every charge, creating a comprehensive record of Marcus's misuse of funds. I moved on to the legal fees, the payments that Marcus had made to his own attorneys. The payments were unauthorized, undocumented, and clearly illegal. I documented the expenses, creating a record that would expose Marcus's financial misconduct. The pieces were falling into place exactly as I had planned. I was building a comprehensive file, a record of Marcus's abuses that was almost impossible to refute. The documentation was meticulous. The witnesses were credible, and the evidence was overwhelming. Marcus's carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and he had no idea who was responsible. I began to organize the evidence, creating a comprehensive file that would be impossible to ignore. The documents were arranged chronologically, each one cross-referenced with the others. The witness statements were transcribed and notarized. The financial records were audited and verified. It was a masterpiece of documentation, a case that would stand up to the most rigorous scrutiny. But I knew that the real battle would be at the board meeting, where the eviction would be decided. The meeting was scheduled for the following month, a formal hearing that would determine my fate. I needed to be prepared, to have everything in order, to anticipate every argument that Marcus would make. I also knew that Marcus would fight back, that he would use every tool at his disposal to protect his position. He would try to intimidate the witnesses, to manipulate the process, to control the narrative. But I had something he didn't have: patience. I had been planning this for months, had anticipated every move he would make, had prepared for every contingency. The revenge I sought wasn't about violence or confrontation. It was about control, about using the tools Marcus had given me to dismantle his life piece by piece. I had learned from the other residents, had absorbed their stories, had developed the patience and the attention to detail that would eventually bring him down. The paper trail was growing, a vast web of documents and testimony that would expose Marcus's abuses to the community. And when the moment came, I would be ready to deliver the final blow. The first vulnerability I exploited was Marcus's embezzlement of HOA funds. I had documented the pattern meticulously: the inflated payments to his brother-in-law's landscaping company, the unauthorized expenses, the legal fees that had been paid from community funds. The evidence was comprehensive, a clear pattern of financial misconduct that would be impossible to explain away. Instead, I orchestrated a series of discoveries that would expose his theft to the people who mattered most. The first discovery was carefully choreographed. I arranged for an anonymous tip to be sent to the HOA's auditing committee, a group of residents who had been appointed to review the community's finances. The tip was detailed, professional, and devastating. It included copies of the inflated invoices, the contracts with Marcus's brother-in-law, and a comparison with market rates that showed the overcharges. The committee was horrified, and they began to investigate. The investigation was thorough, professional, and devastating. It revealed a pattern of financial impropriety, a series of transactions that had benefited Marcus at the expense of the community. The committee's report was a bombshell, a comprehensive account of Marcus's embezzlement that was impossible to refute. The report was shared with the board, the residents, and the authorities. The second vulnerability I exploited was Marcus's secret rental property violations. I had discovered that Marcus was renting out his home through a short-term rental platform, a violation of the HOA's rules. The rules were clear. Rentals of less than 30 days were prohibited, and all rentals required board approval. I documented the violations, creating a comprehensive record that would be almost impossible to refute. I arranged for the evidence to be shared with the board, a formal complaint that triggered an investigation. The investigation was thorough, professional, and devastating. It revealed a pattern of violations, a series of short-term rentals that had been conducted without approval. The board was furious, and they began to question Marcus's leadership. The third vulnerability I exploited was Marcus's strained relationship with the other board members. I had documented the pattern of manipulation, the way Marcus had isolated his opponents, the way he had controlled the board through intimidation and fear. I arranged for the evidence to be shared with the board members, a comprehensive account of Marcus's abuses that would destroy his credibility. The first board member to be swayed was a woman named Patricia, a retired teacher who had been a reluctant supporter of Marcus. She had always had doubts about his leadership. The evidence I provided was the catalyst she needed, a confirmation of her suspicions that gave her the courage to act. She began to question Marcus's decisions, to demand transparency, to call for accountability. The second board member to be swayed was a man named Richard, a businessman who had been a loyal supporter of Marcus. Richard had been drawn to Marcus's confidence, his charisma, his promise of success. But the evidence of financial misconduct was impossible to ignore, a clear violation of the trust that had been placed in him. Richard began to distance himself from Marcus, to question his leadership, to demand answers. The third board member to be swayed was a woman named Alina, a community activist who had been a vocal opponent of Marcus. She had been marginalized, silenced, ignored. But the evidence I provided gave her the ammunition she needed. She began to organize the opposition, to rally the residents, to build a coalition of dissent. The chaos was escalating. I could see it in the eyes of the board members, the whispered conversations at community events, the tense atmosphere that had settled over the neighborhood. Marcus was losing control, his confidence shaken by the revelations that I had orchestrated. He held meetings, issued statements, made promises he couldn't keep, but the damage was done, the trust broken, the narrative impossible to repair. The first public blow came from the auditing committee. They issued a report that detailed Marcus's financial misconduct, a comprehensive account of his embezzlement that was impossible to refute. The report was shared with the residents, the media, and the authorities. The reaction was immediate: outrage, demands for accountability, calls for Marcus's resignation. The second blow came from the rental violations. The board voted to fine Marcus, a substantial penalty that would damage his finances and his reputation. The fine was a public acknowledgement of his misconduct, a clear signal that the board had lost confidence in his leadership. The third blow came from the board members. Patricia, Richard, and Alina had formed a coalition of dissent, a group that was determined to remove Marcus from power. They called for a special meeting, a gathering that would determine Marcus's fate. I watched from my home office, the glow of my computer illuminating the cold satisfaction on my face. The pieces were falling into place. The fourth vulnerability I exploited was Marcus's arrogance. He was a man who believed that he was above the rules, that his position protected him from the consequences of his actions. He was careless, making mistakes that a more cautious man would have avoided. He left a trail of evidence. I began to document his arrogance, cataloging every instance of his overconfidence, his dismissiveness, his contempt for the residents he was supposed to serve. The records were damning, a portrait of a man who had become a predator, who had used his position to enrich himself at the expense of the community. The chaos was becoming unmanageable. Marcus was fighting a losing battle, his desperate attempts to salvage his reputation only making things worse. He held meetings, issued statements, made promises he couldn't keep. But the damage was done, the trust broken, the narrative impossible to repair. I began to see the cracks in his composure. At a board meeting, I watched through a video feed that one of my allies had arranged, and I saw the first real glimmer of fear in his eyes. His hands were trembling. His voice was strained. His confidence was gone. The man who had tried to evict me was now facing his own destruction. The final act was approaching, the moment when I would reveal myself and present the evidence that would seal his fate, but I wasn't ready yet. The revenge would be complete, but only when I was certain that every detail was perfect. I thought about the eviction notice, the cream-colored envelope taped to my door. I thought about the humiliation, the fear, the uncertainty. I thought about the other residents who had been targeted, the lives that had been damaged, the community that had been divided. The satisfaction was building, quiet anticipation that had become almost unbearable. The network I had assembled was now fully operational, a carefully calibrated machine designed to dismantle Marcus's position from every angle. Each piece had been positioned with surgical precision, each relationship exploited, each vulnerability exposed. The chaos was no longer a slow burn. It was a conflagration that was consuming everything Marcus had built. The first domino to fall was Marcus's relationship with the board. The coalition of dissent, led by Patricia, Richard, and Alina, had been growing stronger by the day. They had been sharing information, coordinating their efforts, building a case against Marcus that was comprehensive and devastating. The board members who had once supported Marcus were now questioning his leadership, demanding transparency, calling for accountability. The board convened an emergency meeting, a gathering that was charged with tension and anticipation. Patricia presented the evidence, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and determination. The inflated invoices, the unauthorized expenses, the rental violations, all of it was laid bare for the board to see. The other members were shocked. There were expressions, a blend of horror and indignation. Marcus tried to defend himself, to dismiss the accusations as the work of disgruntled residents. But the evidence was too strong, the documentation too comprehensive. The board voted to suspend Marcus pending a full investigation. The second domino was Marcus's relationship with the residents. I had been cultivating relationships with the people who had been targeted by Marcus, the residents who had been silenced, the voices that had been ignored. Each of them had a story to tell, a piece of the puzzle that would eventually reveal the truth. I organized a meeting, a gathering of the betrayed and the disillusioned. The meeting was held at the community center, a space that had been reserved for events and gatherings. The room was packed, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. Residents filed in, their faces a mixture of anger and hope. I had been waiting for this moment, a chance to finally speak out against the man who had terrorized their community. I stood at the front of the room, my voice calm and measured. Marcus Webb has been running this community like his personal fiefdom. He has embezzled funds, fabricated violations, and harassed residents. He has divided this community and destroyed lives. But today, we are going to take our community back. The room erupted into applause, a cathartic release of years of pent-up frustration. Residents began to share their stories, their voices trembling with emotion. They described the fines, the warnings, the threats. They described the culture of fear that Marcus had created, the atmosphere of intimidation that had silenced them for so long. The stories were compiled into a comprehensive document, a record of Marcus's abuses that was impossible to ignore. The document was shared with the board, the media, and the authorities. The reaction was immediate, a cascade of outrage that further eroded Marcus's support. The third domino was Marcus's relationship with his family. I had been in touch with his wife, a woman named Elizabeth who had been suspicious of his behavior for years. She had seen the changes in him, the secrecy, the defensiveness. She had been silenced by his threats, intimidated into compliance. But now, with the evidence I had provided, she was finally ready to speak out. Elizabeth confronted Marcus in a scene that was witnessed by several neighbors. The confrontation was explosive, a public airing of his private life that was deeply humiliating. Elizabeth shouted accusations, demanded answers, threatened to leave him. Marcus tried to calm her, to deflect her questions, to dismiss her concerns, but the evidence was too strong, the revelations too damaging. The scene was witnessed by dozens of residents, a public humiliation that would be impossible to forget. The fourth domino was Marcus's relationship with the authorities. The evidence of financial misconduct had been referred to the appropriate agencies, and an investigation had been launched. The investigation was thorough, professional. It revealed a pattern of fraud, a series of crimes that would destroy whatever was left of Marcus's reputation. The chaos was becoming unmanageable. Marcus was fighting a losing battle, his desperate attempts to salvage his reputation only making things worse. He held meetings, issued statements, made promises he couldn't keep. But the damage was done, the trust broken, the narrative impossible to repair. I began to see the cracks in his composure. At a community meeting, I watched from the back of the room and I saw the first real glimmer of fear in his eyes. His hands were trembling, his voice was strained, his confidence was gone. The man who had tried to evict me was now facing his own destruction. The first public blow came from the board. They issued a statement announcing Marcus's suspension, citing financial irregularities and ethical violations. The statement was carefully worded, designed to avoid legal liability, but the message was clear: Marcus was in trouble, and his position was in jeopardy. The second blow came from the residents. The stories I had compiled were shared widely, a comprehensive account of Marcus's abuses that was impossible to ignore. The residents who had been silenced were now speaking out, their voices a chorus of condemnation that was impossible to refute. The third blow came from his family. Elizabeth filed for separation, a legal action that was widely publicized and deeply humiliating for Marcus. The separation was messy. The details splashed across the local news, the humiliation complete. Marcus was left alone, his family gone, his reputation in tatters. The fourth blow came from the authorities. The investigation was proceeding, the evidence mounting, the charges inevitable. Marcus was facing criminal charges, a prospect that would destroy whatever was left of his life. I watched from my home office, the glow of my computer illuminating the cold satisfaction on my face. The pieces were falling into place. The final act was approaching, the moment when I would reveal myself and present the evidence that would seal his fate. The eviction hearing was scheduled for the following week, a formal proceeding that would determine my future. But I knew that the hearing would be about more than my eviction. It would be about Marcus's fate, about the community's future, about the truth that had been hidden for too long. I had been patient, had waited months for the right moment. I had documented everything, built a network of allies, and prepared for every contingency. And now I was ready to deliver the final blow. I thought about the eviction notice, the cream-colored envelope taped to my door. I thought about the humiliation, the fear, the uncertainty. I thought about the other residents who had been targeted, the lives that had been damaged, the community that had been divided. The satisfaction was building, a quiet anticipation that had become almost unbearable. But the moment was approaching, and when it came, I would be ready. The eviction hearing was scheduled for Thursday evening, the kind of day that seemed designed to match the gravity of the proceedings. The community center had been transformed into something resembling a courtroom with long tables arranged in a U-shape and chairs filled with nervous residents and board members. The atmosphere was electric, a crackling tension that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Everyone knew that something significant was about to happen. The fate of the community hung in the balance, and the outcome would determine the future of the HOA. I arrived early, as I always did, and took a seat in the front row where I could observe every detail. The room filled slowly, first with the board members, then with the residents, and finally with Marcus and his legal team. Marcus walked in with a lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Vance, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics. Marcus looked haggard, his expensive suit hanging loosely on his frame, his eyes rimmed with red, his hands trembling slightly. The past few weeks had taken their toll on him. The suspension, the investigation, the separation from his wife, each blow had chipped away at his carefully constructed facade. He sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped. In front of him, his eyes fixed on the documents in front of him. The board chairman, a woman named Margaret Chen, called the meeting to order. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to address serious concerns about the management of this community. The board has received extensive documentation that raises questions about the integrity and conduct of our president, Marcus Webb. Marcus's face paled. "This is a witch hunt," he said, his voice strained. "These allegations are baseless, designed to undermine my leadership and destroy the community I have worked so hard to build." I rose from my seat, slowly and deliberately, and walked to the front of the room. The residents turned to look at me, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Curiosity. evidence that Marcus Webb has been embezzling funds, fabricating violations, and harassing residents. I have documented his pattern of abuse, and I am prepared to present it to this board and to this community. Marcus's eyes widened with recognition. You, he hissed. You're behind this. You've been trying to destroy me from the beginning? I ignored him and opened the folder I had been carrying. The documents inside were organized, comprehensive, and damning. These are financial statements showing inflated payments to a landscaping company owned by Marcus's brother-in-law. These are unauthorized expenses that Marcus approved without board approval. These are legal fees that Marcus paid from community funds without authorization. And these are the stories of residents who have been targeted by Marcus's harassment. The room erupted into chaos. Residents were shouting, board members were demanding explanations, and Marcus was desperately trying to defend himself. But the evidence was overwhelming, the documentation irrefutable. The man who had tried to evict me was now facing the consequences of his actions. The first witness was Thomas, the retired teacher who had been targeted for eviction after refusing to support Marcus's re-election campaign. He testified about the fabricated violations, the baseless fines, the threats of eviction. His voice was steady, his testimony clear and compelling. He described the years of stress, the thousands of dollars in legal fees, the toll that Marcus's harassment had taken on his life. The second witness was Alina, the single mother who had been driven out of the community by Marcus's harassment. She testified about the relentless threats, the constant accusations, the fear that had consumed her life. Her voice was trembling, her eyes filled with tears, but her testimony was powerful and persuasive. She described the day she'd given up, sold her home, and moved away, leaving behind the community she had loved. The third witness was David, the former board member who had resigned in protest after witnessing Marcus's abuses. He testified about the manipulation, the pattern of misconduct that had gone unchallenged for years. He described the meetings where Marcus had silenced opposition, the decisions that had been made without proper process, the culture of fear that Marcus had created. The fourth witness was Elizabeth, Marcus's wife. She testified about the changes she had seen in him, the secrecy, the defensiveness, the paranoia. She described the arguments, the accusations, the unraveling of their marriage. Her testimony was a portrait of a man who had been consumed by his own ambition, a man who had sacrificed everything for power. The fifth witness was me. I testified about the eviction notice, the fabricated violations, the pattern of abuse that Marcus had directed at me. I described the months of documentation, the network of allies I had built, the evidence I had compiled. I presented the comprehensive file, a record of Marcus's crimes that was almost impossible to refute. The board adjourned to deliberate, leaving Marcus alone in the community center. His face was ashen, his composure shattered. He sat in silence, his hands trembling, his eyes fixed on the floor. The man who had once been the most powerful person in the community was now a broken figure, his future uncertain, his reputation destroyed. The deliberation was brief. The board returned with a unanimous decision. Marcus was to be removed from his position as president, effective immediately. His eviction was approved, a formal action that would force him to leave the community. He was to forfeit his position, his authority, and his place in the community he had tried to control. Marcus was escorted from the community center, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. The residents applauded, a cathartic release of years of pent-up frustration. The board members shook hands, their expressions a mixture of relief and determination. The community was finally free, a new chapter in a story that had begun with a cream-colored envelope. I watched from the front row, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet sense of closure. The revenge was complete, the justice served, the cycle of betrayal finally broken. The nightmare was over and the future was bright. In the months that followed, the community began to heal. The board implemented new policies, ensured transparency and restored trust. Marcus was gone, his name a cautionary tale, a warning to anyone who might be tempted to follow in his footsteps. I remained in the community, a symbol of resistance and resilience. I continued to attend meetings, to volunteer for committees, to contribute to the community's success. The revenge I had sought was not about destroying Marcus, but about restoring justice. And in the end, justice had prevailed. The story had reached its conclusion, and I was at peace. Marcus's eviction was humiliating, a public acknowledgement of his crimes that would follow him for the rest of his life. The HOA board had been restored, the community had been healed, and justice had been served. I had not used violence or confrontation, but patience, observation, and the power of documentation. The paper trail I had created was the instrument of his destruction, a comprehensive record of his abuses that was almost impossible to refute. He had underestimated me, had assumed that the resident he had targeted was too weak to fight back. But he had been wrong, and now he was paying the price. The community had been divided by Marcus's tyranny, but it had been united by the struggle against him. The residents who had been silenced were finally heard, their voices a chorus of condemnation that was impossible to ignore. The board members who had been complicit were held accountable, their actions scrutinized, their decisions reversed. The community was once again a place of trust, cooperation, and respect. I sat in my home, the room quiet and still, and reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The months of careful planning, the years of patient observation, the days of waiting. The revenge had not been impulsive or violent. It had been methodical, deliberate, and devastating. I had used the tools Marcus had given me to dismantle his life piece by piece, and in the end, he had destroyed himself. The satisfaction was not in his suffering, but in the knowledge that justice had been served. The community was free, and I could finally move forward, carrying the weight of the past, but no longer defined by it.